Hello, in today's video I'm going to be painting this watercolor finch. The first step is to do a light pencil sketch of your subject matter. You don't need to do too many details, but I would mark out the light and dark areas very gently with a pencil. Don't press too hard or you may find you indent or wreck your page. You also don't want these lines to show up in your final artwork. I've sped up the video just to get into the painting a little bit sooner, but feel free to pause it if you want to use my video as a reference. When you're done the drawing, use a kneadable eraser and gently roll it over your sketch. This will lighten the pencil lines enough for you to start painting without having to worry about any pencil lines being in your artwork. If you don't have a kneadable eraser, simply just draw lighter and erase around your lines as needed. The next thing we're going to do is wet down the page. One of the great things about this particular painting is we don't need to wet down around the subject matter. We can simply wet down everywhere, which makes this step a little easier. Now we're going to add paint into the wet page. I'm adding Payne's gray here. I'm establishing some darks around the outsides, and then I'll move in with a little bit of mixed in green and brown closer to the finch. If we were to go dark right up next to the finch, we would need to preserve the finch shape a little bit better, but because the color we're using is actually lighter than the value of the finch, at least most of the finch, it doesn't really matter if a little bit of paint gets into our bird. So we can be a little bit more carefree with this step. You can see the water taking the paint here. Now my paint is actually starting to dry just a little bit. And one thing I like to do when I'm experiencing fast drying paint on a dry day is I like to use a spray bottle to just reapply some water to my page. So I'm going to do this, and it's going to give me a very interesting texture. So if you add water to an already wet surface, if you add big blobs of water, you're going to get kind of little pools of water and paint happening. And if you add little tiny drips of water like I'm going to do with a spray bottle, you're going to get that happening, but it's going to be on a very small scale, and it's going to give you kind of a speckled look. I'm still applying just a little bit of darks here, trying to build up my values there. So I just used the spray bottle. So you can see there's small little dots throughout. I'm applying a little bit more paint here. I'm going to do another spray with the spray bottle as we get a little further in the painting. There we go. There's another one there. And now I'm just going in here and I'm adding some water to a few areas that got a little bit neglected by the spray bottle. So you can actually see, I'm zoomed in really close here, so you can see how the water kind of almost like a snowflake just takes over the paint, and then you can see how the paint does the same thing, only, you know, dark instead of light. So this is a really good way to get a nice speckled effect. I think it would be wonderful for a snowy day. It's very important to wait for the painting to dry before you go into the next step, which is adding in our base tones. The finch has kind of a brownish belly, at least at the bottom part, so we're going to be adding in a nice warm brown tone. This is only as dark as our lightest value, so we're going to be using this as a base layer, and we'll build in texture and shadow as we go here. I used a clean brush to soften the top so I didn't have a hard line, and now I'm using a grainier brush to add in some wispy feather textures. This is also called a rake brush or a wisp brush or even a comb brush. Just a brush with a few fewer bristles at the tip than there are at the back. It's a very good brush for applying texture like fur and feathers to animals. Again, we're just building up our base, so a lot of paint is still to come. Now I'm adding in the gray. This is a very important step because the chest of the bird is a white gray color, and because it's so light, we're not actually going to be layering too much more here. So what you see is kind of what you get for the gray going into the white. Now that that's dried, I'm adding just a little bit more shadow. I'm using a number 10 round brush here, and I'm using a dark brown. And I'm just kind of gently dabbing it in along the edges and along the bottom. You can see I'm tapping my brush to get a little bit of a feather texture here. Adding a bit of water to transition out of those darks and up into my highlight of the chest. There's a little hint of brown around the head, not too much though. I actually need to lift a little bit of paint out here with a clean brush. One of the nice things about watercolor paint is that you can lift paint out with a clean damp brush as long as the paint is still wet. Now I'm adding in a dark gray back to the bird. This isn't quite the wing, this is almost like the down feathers on the back here. Again, I'm just picking up a little bit of paint with a clean brush. I do this a lot when I'm painting. It really helps to get a soft edge. Just refining that tip a little bit on the wing. And now I'm going to go in with some darks and just kind of lean into the dark a little bit. My paint is still wet on the page, so this is going to give me soft edges around my dark. So my dark isn't going to just have a hard edge. It's going to gradually fade into the gray that I've already applied for this section of the bird. Just tapping in a little bit of texture here again. Now I'm adding in some soft feathers up by what I want to call is maybe the shoulder. Lifting some of that out with a paper towel. Now that the belly is dry, I'm jumping back in with yet another layer of shadow. And I'm going to do this a few more times. Wait for one area to dry and then layer and then go back and forth from wing to belly to foot. So we'll be jumping around the bird quite a bit, just waiting for different areas to dry. Again, just tapping in that texture. So I'm basically doing the same thing I did last time, except I'm doing it again with a slightly darker color, and that's going to help build up my values. So every layer just gets a little darker in here. When you're tapping in your texture like this, you do usually want a damp background. That way you don't get those crisp dots. You get kind of fuzzy, feathery-like dots. Now there's a little tail feather here that's white, but it's in shadow, so we're going to be adding that in, and we have a cast shadow along the top there where the wing kind of comes over top, and we have a core shadow along the bottom. So it ends up giving us a really nice kind of shape here, and I'm really leaning into my core shadow here along the bottom. Now the whole area is wet, which again is going to give us a nice soft feathery edge so that I won't get any hard edges when I'm adding in my very dark paint here. It's going to make everything feel nice and light. Adding a little bit more shadow again back into the brown part of the bird, just a few little dabs here. So as you go, you'll find, you'll be adding different layers at different times, but you just want to make sure you're doing it at the appropriate time. So if you want your colors to fade into each other, do it while your page is damp. If you want your color to sit on top of the other color and layer in, then make sure your page is dry before you add your paint. Now I'm doing another layer on the wing. Again, we've already added in our base tone, so now it's time to really lean into the texture. So I'm just adding a little bit more shadow, a little bit more texture into this part of the wing. It's quite a bit darker than my paint is showing here. Now we can add in the foot. So I'm just doing a light undertone of the foot. The foot has a little bit of an orangey brown tint to it, so that's why I'm going in just with a really light brown. One of the nice things about this, a foot is finicky, and if I make any mistakes, my paint is so light that it won't matter. So I could basically blend this right into the trunk if I want to. By going really light first though, it gives me a map, and then if that looks good, which it does, I'll be able to lean into it with my darks. So now that I have established the shape a little bit better, I can lean into it with my darker values. And just like the body of the bird, we're gonna go back and forth here, kind of adding texture bit by bit as we go. Trying to give some separation to the different toes by giving a shadow to the bottom left-hand side and a highlight to the upper right-hand side of each toe. A little bit of a cast shadow here underneath the bird's, where the bird's body is. And now that I'm zoomed in, you can see I'm using a very fine brush here to do my details. The brush has a very long head to it. The head itself is probably about an inch, maybe even longer, long, but a very fine tip. So it means it'll hold a lot of paint and water while still giving me really, really precise lines. So I don't have to go back and refill the brush as much. It's a really, really good brush for watercolor. Okay, we're getting into the head now. So the bird has a very dark head, like the top of the head is very dark. Kind of like a chickadee, the black surrounds the eye, goes down to the beak, and gives it almost a mask. So we're going to be adding that in. And just like we did when we added the feathers in on the back, we're going to go light first. And then after we've added in our lighter value, we're going to add in our dark values. Pretty much like we've done on every part of this. That's just kind of the way I like to do watercolor, is you go in with your light values and you layer in your darker values as you go. I'm trying to be careful to leave the eye alone, but the eye itself does actually go gray, so it's okay to get a little bit of this in there. I'm trying to clean up my eye a bit. In doing so, I'm actually kind of blending by accident, but that's, again, it's totally fine. When we add in the eye, it'll be nice and dry, so we'll be able to go in with a really aggressive Payne's gray and make that eye pop. Speaking of Payne's gray, I'm going in with a number, I think this is a number 2 round, and I'm just using the very tip of the brush to give me some texture, to add in those shadows of that top of the head. So the head is still wet, it's still damp, it's not soaking wet, but it's wet enough that it's going to pull the paint and give me a nice soft look there. Still trying to leave a little bit of a highlight around the top, but go in really dark around the back and then close to the beak as well. Around the eye, we're going to get quite a bit darker too here. But there is still a little bit of a highlight at the tip, so we want to make sure the very top of the head retains a little bit of that highlight. Subtle things like this can make a really big difference. Your painting will feel flat if you just go in with a solid color and leave it. But if you build up a few layers, you'll find that your paintings have more volume, they have more texture, and as a result, they look more realistic. Now I'm adding in the longer feathers of the wing here. I'm using long brush strokes to do this. These brush strokes reflect the shape of the feather. The feathers are kind of folded in on top of each other, which make them look very thin and packed in together. In reality, of course, feathers expand, but because the bird is in the seated position, they're all kind of in there tight, and that gives them that line look that I'm adding in. So I'm adding in long lines here to try to reflect the feather texture. So whereas all of my other brush strokes up to this point have been rather short, these ones are long, and they're long on purpose. I'm using my number 2 round here. And again, I'm using a rather light tone. The wing is very, very dark. So believe it or not, this is actually my lightest value here, leaving a little bit of highlight in there at the tips of some of those feathers there. There's multiple layers of feathers we're seeing. And then there's a little bit of white right at, I'm going to call it the shoulder. I'm not sure what it's called, but there's a little bit of white up there. I'm going to be preserving that as well. So I'm getting close to that white area now. Again, you want nice long strokes here. So as my paint is drying, I'm kind of going back in and I'm reapplying some long strokes to help build up my value. I don't want hard lines, that's why I decided to do that when the paint was still damp. Now I'm up doing the part above the white, again, just adding in my light value first and then building some darks into that. Again, long strokes on the bottom, adding in that texture now, trying to leave a little bit of space in between so that you can still see a slight highlight where the feather would separate from the feather beneath it. And now we're adding in our last little round of feathers here. So there's 3 tiers of feathers, I guess. These ones actually tuck behind the log, so you're going to see that I only paint out into the log, and then I'm going to have a little bit of feather poking out around the back, a little bit of that wing. Just a bit. These feathers are just a little bit darker, so I'm going in with a darker base tone here. And it's time to drop in the log. I'm using the belly of the brush here, so that means that my brush, I'm using a round brush, but I'm using the entire brush. So you can see I'm kind of painting it at an edge here. I'm painting from the side. When you use the belly of the brush, you put down a lot of paint quickly, and you actually run out of paint quickly too. So as you run out of paint, you get this kind of broken brush look, which is perfect for trees. It's a little choppy. It's beautiful when you can do it. It takes a bit of practice to get it done or to get it right. You don't want too much paint. You just want enough paint that kind of skips about. I'm just adding in kind of the shadowy values, again, starting light, and then I'll build in darker as we go. That way, if I make a mistake, it's not a big deal. I can always paint over it within that branch area. My background is done. I definitely want to stay out of the background at this point. So if I were to, say, drop my paintbrush and do a mistake that I couldn't fix in my background, what I would do instead of trying to fix it is I would paint over it with something like a branch so that I could just hide it. To go in and try to fix up this background right now would kind of break up the texture that we've established, and you would get some really kind of aggressive outlines probably that you don't want. So yeah, I always say if you make a mistake, just paint into it. So you can see using the belly of the brush there to get some really nice texture, just dropping it in there. So it preserves some highlights. It gives us some very natural looking kind of barky, rough textures. And it's a very easy thing to do, but it looks really hard. So when you see it in the final artwork, you're probably like, whoa, how did you do that texture? But in reality, it's just a couple of brush strokes using the belly of the brush with just the right amount of paint, and it gives you that broken up look. And of course, if you want darker values, just use less water, more paint. Lighter values, more water, less paint. But just make sure the brush has the same amount of wetness to it. So you can do it with either a wash level of paint, like a really, really watered down paint, or you can do it with really aggressive thick paint, and it works with both. You just have to have the brush be the same amount of wet. But the ratio of water to paint is up to you. Now I'm painting around. I got a little bit carried away talking about that. I just love the belly of the brush so much. So I'm just adding in some details now. We're getting pretty close to being done, at least the larger areas here. We still have a foot and a beak and an eye to do, of course. And I like to fuss with detail at the end of my painting a little bit, but we're getting pretty close now. Everything's starting to come together. So it looks like there's a piece of this branch that has been cut off, and that's where we're getting this little brown kind of circular shape here, and I'm giving it some nice shadows now. There's little shadows throughout that where the bark is kind of overhanging the cut part. So I'm just going in and adding the texture here. You can really see the belly of the brush at work. Now I'm just going to add in the back part of this branch here, so it'll separate itself from the tail, so you'll be able to see where the brush ends. So far I've just been doing shadows. This is a highlight side, which is why I've kind of left it out. So now we're adding in our highlight tones. So I'm not really using the belly of the brush here, I'm just using it to get a base tone, and then I'll use the belly of the brush to add the texture. As long as you're not using too much water, you should be able to apply paint over top of your textures without losing them too much. If you have a lot of water and you really work the paint, you'll remix everything together. So if you're going over top of texture you really like, just try not to do it with too much water. I've noticed that my shadow is far too light, so I'm going back in and I'm adding in just a little bit more. And this tree was cut as well, so there's a little bit of a rounded off stump at the top here that I'm trying to call out as well. There's some deep shadow areas here that I'm just diving into now with the Payne's gray. Again, I like to build into these dark areas rather than jump in right away. I like to kind of build up to them. Using a little bit of the belly here to get some rough textures in there. Going back in with some darks. Again, layering, building up the darks, giving me some texture here with the belly. I really enjoy painting the roughness of trees close up like this. I do spend quite a bit of time on this branch here, so I'm just going to fast forward. I'm basically just layering in texture and detail here for the next few minutes, and so I'll get right to the right back into the bird here for you. I don't want to jump around in my painting though, so I do want to just show you the little steps that I'm taking to get to where I end up here. But again, it's just layering. All right, now we're into the beak. We want to have start with a wet beak, so that way you don't get any hard lines, and then we're going to drop in our darker values. So where the beak, top of the beak meets the bottom of the beak, we have a really dark line there, so I'm just trying to go in with some Payne's gray, add a nice dark line, and then I'm hoping that that kind of bleeds into the dampness of the paper, but it's not moving too much, so I'm going to have to kind of do a little bit of work here to make that soften. So I'm just going to go in with a clean brush here and pull up the Payne's gray so that it gets nice and soft. There's a little bit of a textured ridge along the beak, in between the beak and the feathers of the head, so that's why I'm leaving that highlight there for that ridge. And the bottom of the beak is considerably darker, so I'm going to go in and do the bottom of the beak just a little bit more aggressively. Just adding back in a little bit of darkness on the top while it's still wet there. It's catching the water a little bit better this time, which is nice. And now I'm going into the bottom. Going back into the top a bit, back and forth. Adding in that textured ridge now. I'm finding that my background is blending in a little bit with the tone of my beak, so I'm giving it a little bit of an outside ridge, a little bit of a dark ridge, which it doesn't actually have in my reference, but I do want to get that separation, and it's believable that it would be there, so I'm just adding a very, very little bit of it. And now I'm going back into the head, adding in some texture, and it's time for the eye, so I'm zoomed right in here. I'm using very concentrated Payne's gray, drawing in the circle of the eye first, and then I'm going to fill in the eye, leaving out our highlight. Now that eye really pops now, and it's time to kind of go in and do some fussing. So getting in, again, small little tiny feathers here. So I'm adding texture with my tiny little detail pen. I think this is, or sorry, paintbrush. I think this is a 0. It's not super, super tiny, but it's got a good point on it, and that's what matters. It has a nice belly on it too, so I'm able to kind of flatten it out here and get some good belly textures into the top feathers there. Again, just using darker values every time I layer in. These little details are important. Now there's a little bit of a cheek shadow here, so I'm just adding that in, starting with some paint and then pulling the paint out. There we go. Kind of starting in at that ridge and then pulling out, trying to fade it so that it's not too aggressive of an edge on the far side, just on the upper side. And then there's a little bit of a ridge around the eye there where the eye socket is. And just those two little things, like it's such a light brown color, barely noticeable, but having them in there makes a huge difference from how it looked before. I'm emphasizing that ridge by just adding a slight shadow with some really watered down Payne's gray now. Adding a little bit of feather texture to the lighter parts of the bird. Using the belly of the brush here to again add just another layer of kind of shadow to the bottom where there would be a cast, not a cast shadow, a core shadow. And now we're going in with some Payne's Gray and our 0 brush, and we're adding in the details of the feet. So the one foot is pretty much built out. We just need some more aggressive shadows and wrinkles. And the other foot we still have to build out. But those claws are really important. They're really dark and they tend to hold a highlight because they're a little bit reflective. And they give the foot, I don't know, they give the foot, I don't know, they kind of help it out with its form, I guess. They're a really big part of a bird's foot. Sometimes the claw is almost as big as the digit, so it's a really important part to add in. Much cooler than anything else. I feel like without it, it looks very wrong, so you really need to throw those in, and it's nice when they're big like this. Again, just really focusing on the shadow and highlight here between the toes to separate them from each other and from the background. A lot of detail painting with this little brush here. And again, adding in that beautiful talon, trying to preserve a little bit of highlight. It doesn't really matter that we have the gray from the branch underneath because the highlight itself is quite subtle. So the branch texture is completely fine in there. Actually gives the nail itself a little bit of texture, which is nice too. And again, we're doing the same thing over here. So we didn't need to preserve a spot for this nail. We just simply painted it over the branch texture that we've laid in. And it'll show up in the highlight, but it shows up in a way that actually looks quite realistic. So we don't mind that at all. It's a nice thing about a dark object on a lighter surface is you can kind of get away with painting in your entire surface and then dropping in the object on top, and then you don't have to paint around things. Just kind of makes it a little easier. Again, just fussing with those little wrinkles. All of these things do matter though. Now the back foot, we're going to be adding in again our base tone. The back foot is very dark. So it's a little less important here, but we still want to start with that base tone. So we're using that kind of brownish base tone like we did on the front foot. And then we're going to jump in right away here with some shadow tones, with some nice dark tones for that foot. The front foot is the one that's slightly more, I don't know, it's more visible, I guess. The back one is a little bit more muddied by both the lighting and the position of the toes. Just it doesn't kind of accentuate each toe as much as the front foot does. So yeah, the dark foot's a little less detailed. So you can see I'm really going in with my darks here. So what's happening is there's probably more of a cast shadow on the back foot than there is on the front foot. And that's why we see a little less detail. We don't really get those highlights in the nails like we had on the front foot. Now I'm tempted to fast forward through this, but I do think that even though it's kind of slow and you know, we're really zoomed in and we're doing tiny little strokes, it's still important. So again, adding in these shadows to help separate the toes and then trying to soften the shadows by just pulling up with the brush, kind of shaking the brush even to give it a nice natural look. But again, this is a very dark part of the foot, so we're just going to maintain those highlights and then everything else doesn't have to be perfect. And we're still just kind of fussing with details here. I learned to draw long before I learned to paint, and I feel like I take a lot of that drawing knowledge and I apply it to my watercolor paintings. So you can see I'm adding just a little bit more shadow into the wing feathers, and then I'm also adding in this tip here, just poking out behind the branch. using a very, very concentrated Payne's gray to get the nice dark value that we're seeing here. And those nice long brush strokes in the wing are going to give us the texture of those feathers that we're looking for. So we're done the bird now. We're just going to go in and add again some of that nice dark value into our branch using the belly of the brush. Almost scribbling here with my brush. Dabbing in these little textures, these little shadows, just to make the branch feel nice and bumpy and a little bit more realistic. If your branch is too flat, it just won't feel real. Big fan of texture in all my artwork. I'm just emphasizing this little shadow that's created by the bark around that edge there. And that's it. That's our bird. I could fuss with detail all day, but we're going to call it quits here and be happy with what we have. You can see that beautiful background created by the spray bottle, all of the texture created by the belly of the brush, and the dry brushing as well in the bird. I hope you guys enjoyed this painting. If you would like feedback on your painting, feel free to send it to Creations by Kendra on Facebook or Creations_by_Kendra on Instagram. Thanks so much, guys. Happy painting.